Hi, my name is Amy Friend from During Quiet Time. My favorite sewing technique is paper piecing. I'm here today to share with you a great beginning paper piece block. This block can be found in my book, Intentional Piecing. You'll need to purchase the book in order to photocopy the foundation template. This block is really fun to sew. It doesn't have any complicated angles, and it can even be chain pieced once you get going. The fun of this block is the fabric selection. The quilt is called Tell Me a Story because each block is created to tell a story. Between the fussy cut and the outer border, you create a fun story to keep you amused while you're sewing. For example, for this block I selected a girl riding her bike through the streets of Rome with bread in her basket. It can be a very simple story like that where the fabric just works well together. In this block I chose a penguin. It's a really quirky Japanese print with text on its stomach, and then I found this other quirky print that had circles with text, and I thought, oh, well, it would suit a texty penguin to have texty snowballs. All right, let's get sewing. So first we need to collect our supplies. You'll need your book Intentional Piecing in order to make a copy of the template. All paper piecing is done on a template, which is basically your pattern drawn out in lines and sectioned and numbered for you. And the important thing is to always make sure that this is printed at 100%. If you print a PDF from my shop, for example, when you go to print it, you want to select actual size or 100%, scaling none. In order to check that, I know that this is a 6-inch block, so I'm just going to take my ruler and just measure right across the top there without the seam allowance, and it's 6 inches. So any pattern should have either a 1 inch by 1 inch square to check your size, or what my patterns often have is it will say something like section A12 measures such and such a number of inches, and you can double check that. So once you have your template, you'll need to cut your pieces. We need a fussy cut print, the outside borders, the black triangles for the inner edges, and then the low volume triangles for the outside edges. My favorite pins are these clover pins. They're very flat and long. They're flat-headed as opposed to the round-headed pins. And the reason I like that is when you flip over your paper piecing to stitch, they don't get caught in your sewing machine. And they're also very strong pins, so it's easy to pin through fabric layers and the paper. I also love having a light box. This is a light box by the Daylight Company. You just push that down to get it brighter and brighter. Another thing that can work is an outside window. You can hold your paper piecing up to the window or to a bright light source. Right. So with paper piecing, we're going to work on the back side of the template, the wrong side of the template, and that's where our finished block will appear. So we're going to take our center fussy cut, which will be placed in the A1 section, and we're going to put that face down so the right side of the fabric is down on the light box. And then this piece goes on top, so the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the template. And we arrange this until we're happy with the way the object in the fussy cut fits within the shape of the frame. Because I'm using a striped background, I really want to keep those stripes lined up, so I'm lining them up with the seam lines on either side. Then I'm going to put a pin here. Now the next section we're going to work on is section A2. So we take a black triangle and we're going to place it for section A2 by flipping this template around and then taking the black triangle and extending it 1/4 inch beyond this stitching line. So once you have the black fabric there, it's hard to see the line. So what you can do is you can just fold it back a little bit, see the line, adjust things, and then place it again. So picture this with me. Once you stitch that line, you're going to be folding this triangle back, and it's going to be covering the A2 section. So with a small piece like this, I'll often just hold it with my hands and move to my sewing machine, but you can choose to put a pin here instead. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch this line between section A1 and A2. First, we're going to back stitch out here about 1/4 inch, stitch all the way along, and then back stitch again. I like to use a 1.6 millimeter stitch length, which is really tiny stitches, and a size 90 needle. And the reason for that is it makes a lot of punctures and larger punctures, and you have to take out all the papers at the end. It makes it a lot easier. I just remembered another tip I want to mention before I stitch this line. I've noticed when I'm teaching workshops that after people pin on section A1, they like to go straight to their machine to stitch this line. I think you feel like you pin something on, you're ready to sew. But in paper piecing, you actually have to have 2 sections pinned before you're ready to sew. It's a common mistake. So now we're going to start stitching along this line. I'm going to bring my needle down roughly a 1/4 inch beyond the line. I'm going to take a couple of back stitches as I sew. When you go to remove your papers, it puts a little bit of pressure on your stitches, and I don't like to have them come undone. We're going to stitch along the line, extending again a little bit, and then back stitching. And that's the first seam. Our next step is to trim the seam allowance. In this case, there's not much there to trim, but the general practice is we fold the paper back and then turn it over, take our ruler, place it along the edge of the paper, and then trim that 1/4 inch. In this case, didn't do too much. And then we need to press this back. After each piece you have to press, and it's really important because otherwise when you go to join blocks on the edges, things won't match up. So now we're going to flip this back over and can see that we're going to piece A3, A4, and A5 all in the same way with the black triangles. So to go in order, A3 is right here. We're going to take our black triangle, and again, this is the line right here. It's a little hard to see here because it's on a stripe. I lined up my stripe with it. But we're going to extend the black triangle a 1/4 inch over. And we can check, see, right there, that's the line. And that one's in position. Now, I mentioned before this block is great for chain piecing. And you can see that it doesn't really matter which order we do these triangles in this particular case. So we can go ahead and get them all pinned into position. Now I'm going to bring this to my sewing machine. I'm going to do the same exact things I did here between A1 and A2. I'm going to do that here along A3, along A4, and along A5. Alright, so now I have all 3 of those lines stitched, and now I'm going to trim back the excess on each of those lines. So you can see here I have a little bit more to trim, and it makes a little bit more sense than it did in that last piece. There we go, and now we're just going to press all of these triangles open. Now we have all of those triangles pressed out. And if we look at our template again, we're going to be stitching section 6 and 7 next. And just like these triangles, they don't touch each other, so we can pin and stitch both of them at the same time. So I have my block on the light table again, and we can see these lines between sections A1 and 6 and 7. We're going to take our border fabric and just extend a 1/4 inch over that line because we're going to be covering that section right there. So that's approximately a 1/4 inch, and it covers on both sides. Same thing here, about a 1/4 inch over this line. And then I can put a pin just to hold those 2 down. Now I can bring this to my sewing machine and stitch a 1/4 inch beyond all the way across, and the same here, and do both of those pieces at the same time. Alright, so when we go to trim these pieces, it's a little bit different than before because these black triangles are stitched down to the paper. So when we go to fold the paper below, that becomes a problem. All we do is just pull those stitches off of the paper foundation and then flip it over to trim. And you want to make sure that you pull all the stitches out so that you get a nice straight line here. Otherwise, when you trim, these black triangles will end up being bumps beyond the edge. And that's not always a problem, but it does become a problem when you're using light colored fabrics, and then you might see that black right through on your finished quilt. So once again, now we're just going to press these open. Next we're going to stitch sections A8 and A9, and again we can do those both at the same time. So we're going to take our longer border strips and line these up 1/4 of an inch beyond this line. It's a little harder for me to see it over here, but once I have this lined up, making sure that it extends beyond the edges of the block, I can fold this back and just confirm that that's at least 1/4 of an inch over. And I can see right here that it's 1/4 of an inch over. And then we're going to do the same thing here, making the fabric strip extend 1/4 of an inch beyond this line. And then again, I can pin both of these together and stitch them at the same time. I'm going to put 2 pins in just because these are longer strips. Now I'm going to stitch along this line on both sides, and I do stitch within the seam allowance, and if it's a little hard for you to figure out where you should put your needle in, what I sometimes will do is with my fingernail just make a little dent here to show me what a straight line would look like so that I put my needle in at the right place. Okay, so just to go over that again, we're going to stitch here within the seam allowance, so I'm going to put my needle down lined up with this line. And make sure that when you take your initial back stitch that it's within the seam allowance, because when we trim down the block you don't want to cut off your back stitches. We're going to stitch all the way along this line. And at this end again we're going to back stitch. And now we do the same thing for the line between the center sections and A9. Alright, so now it's time to trim down the excess in the seam allowance, and again we have stitches through the paper, so we're just going to pull those all right up to the seam, turn it over, and then trim. Now inevitably when you're new to paper piecing, you're going to trim the correct fabric off rather than the excess. You're going to accidentally somehow cut this piece off, or you're going to cut your paper off, and that just happens. If you're aware that it might be an issue, you might be able to stop it, but just about everyone has done that at some point or another. The best one to do if you have to make that mistake is to cut the paper off, because you can always Scotch tape it back in place. Just put your Scotch tape on the foundation where you won't be stitching, because you don't want your needle to go through the sticky tape. If you cut off the wrong part of the fabric, there's really no solution other than seam ripping and putting on a new piece of fabric. Now we're going to press both of these out. Alright, so now we just have those outer triangles to do, and in this case again, even though the numbering calls for section A, 10, then 11, then 12, then 13, we're able to pin all of them at the same time. You won't find that with every block, but it works well with this particular block. So we're going to take our outer triangles and extend them 1/4 of an inch beyond this line. It's a little hard to see because this is a darker fabric, so I'm going to show you that trick again where I fold this fabric down, and so I want to move my fabric back a bit. Just see, okay, that looks like about 1/4 of an inch. I can pin that one and do the same for each corner. Now we're going to take this to our sewing machine and stitch each of these 4 seams, extending into the seam allowance. Alright, so now all of our outer triangles are stitched, and we just have to trim the seam allowance. This one's pretty easy because there's no stitches to remove on 2 of the triangles. We're just going to pull that back and trim down. These 2 triangles, you do have to pull the stitches. Okay, and now we press all those triangles out. So there's our final pressed block. The last step is trimming down, and you do want to trim down to the seam allowance before you join your blocks together. I've seen people try to join paper piece blocks without trimming down, and it's so much more difficult. So you're going to line up your ruler and cut that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around your block. And there we go. There's a finished Tell Me a Story block. The story behind this one is Nina likes to go to her grandmother's house where they have tea parties and learn cross stitch, and she has lace curtains in the window. I hope you enjoyed this video.